Well, happy Sunday evening, everybody. I am Mark Meckler. I'm your host for the Sunday evening BattleCry. You already knew that, though, because that's why you're here, right? I really appreciate you guys being here on Sunday evenings. It's something really important that I think that we do together. It gives me a chance to get input from you and to tell you what I think of some of the news of the week. And I want to say just some of the news, because every week the news is so jam-packed. We live in this 24/7 news cycle. I hope you're not completely sucked in by it. I am because I have to be. It's what I do for a living. But I hope that for those of you who don't do what I do for a living, who don't comment on politics for a living, who aren't engaged in politics every day for a living, that you don't have to stay so in it. And that's one of the reasons we do the Sunday night battle cry, because it gives me a chance to digest a bunch of the news of the week and sort of give it back to you in a way that makes sense to me. Not all of it, again. These are not even what I would necessarily say are the most important stories of the week. They're just things that jumped out at me. You may not have noticed some of these things. Hopefully, I'm giving you some additional perspectives. So let's jump right into it with what we always start with is what's the call to action? Because it's not enough just to think about the news, watch the news, listen to the news. If you're going to do all that, that's great, although not obsessively, like I said. But it's really important that we do something about it. If we're frustrated by what's going on in the world, and Lord knows, if you're not frustrated by what's going on in the world right now, you're probably watching the wrong guy. Anyway, if you are frustrated, then you need to do something. And so this time of year, there's something really important you can do. It's already taken place in some states. In a bunch of states, it hasn't yet. And that is the primary. You need to participate in the primary. You know, when I go around the country and I look at how many people vote in the primaries around the country, it's like 21 to 28% of eligible voters vote in a primary. I want you to think about that. One out of every 4 or 5 voters. Those are bad numbers. That's not something to be proud of. It's not a good thing. We need more people participating in the primaries, but more importantly, we need more of the right kind of people participating in the primaries. And that means you. One of the reasons that people don't participate in the primaries is we don't even know when they are. You know, you all know that the national election, first Tuesday in November, we know that. That's the way it is. Every election, first Tuesday in November. That's just a fixed date. Your local primaries, which are run by your parties in your own state, are on odd days. They're not on the same day every cycle. Sometimes they're a weekday. Some days it might fall on a Saturday. It's different in every state. They change from time to time. They're not heavily promoted by the parties either. Why? Well, parties don't really like primaries. It doesn't make sense for them to like primaries because a primary is a challenger challenging an incumbent. Always easier for a party to support an incumbent than to support a fight between a challenger and an incumbent. I don't mean that in any corrupt way. That's just human nature. And so that's the way it's going to work. The party doesn't really want you paying attention to primaries, generally speaking. Not always true, but generally speaking. And so you really got to pay attention. Now, the good news that connects to the fact that most people aren't paying attention to the primaries is if you do, your vote has an outsized influence, probably worth 3 to 4 times more than your vote would be worth in a general election because so few people vote. So few votes often decide an important primary. So if you haven't had primaries in your state, figure out who the candidates are you support, go work for them, give money, knock on doors, make phone calls, text on behalf of those people, and most importantly, get out and vote. Not just you. Make sure your family votes. Make sure your friends who are going to vote your way according to your values get out and vote. This is your base obligation as a citizen to pay attention, to be educated, to vote. And I would add to get the people that you know and that you love that are going to vote the way you vote, generally speaking, to get out and vote as well. There's a lot of reasons to do that. The country's future is in your hands. The policies that are driving culturally this country in a particular direction are really in your hands if you do the right thing. One of the things that I've seen in the last 10 years, probably maybe 15 years in my lifetime, certainly since Barack Obama was president, is a radical resurgence of racism. Race relations, in my opinion, at this point in my life are at an all-time low in my life, right? It's really horrible. And is it because people generally speaking are more racist? I don't think that's the case. It's because this kind of racism, this kind of race hatred, this kind of uh, fomenting of one race, hatred of one race against another, primarily fomenting the hatred of blacks and Hispanics, any people of color against white people is done by the radical left. This is constant. Racism is everywhere. And you will hear the left say, well, you can't be racist if you're black or you're Hispanic or gay or whatever it is, because you don't hold the levers of power. Look, racism, I'm not going to let them redefine racism. Racism is a predetermined judgment of somebody else based on the color of their skin. It's pretty simple. It's a negative predetermination, a judgment made on the color of somebody else's skin. And when you take that predetermination and you use it against people, you deprive people of opportunity. That's racism in action. Sometimes it's done by private private entities. I would argue enemies. And sometimes it's done by the government. So in our first story today, I want to talk about racism by the government. In Erie County, Pennsylvania, they gave away $300,000 in grants. And the main requirement for those $300,000 in business grants for non-white businesses, that was it. Non-white. You have to be not white. Racism, right? You guys understand. That's just base level racism. If you're black, if you're Hispanic, I guess if you're Asian, though sometimes they consider Asians to be whites. I don't understand any of this racial categorization stuff, but they have a program, literally $300,000 they gave away to non-white businesses. So if you're a struggling white business, a starting white business, if you're a poor person who happens to be white, who's not really had as much opportunity as maybe somebody that could go out and get a regular loan or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. If you're white, you're out. And we have to attack these programs. We have to sue against these programs. By the way, these programs are all illegal. Let me just say that very clearly. These programs are all illegal under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I have my own problems with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I think there was a lot wrong with that act. I think there's a lot in it that's unconstitutional. But under existing law, under the 64 Civil Rights Act, it is illegal to discriminate, for the government to discriminate on the basis of race. But here we have it in Erie, Pennsylvania. That's going on right now. And it's infuriating and it shouldn't stand. So I'm calling out to, yes, you, America First Legal, my favorite legal organization out there, run by Stephen Miller, doing the best lawfare in the country on the right. Full disclosure, my son is also an attorney at America First Legal, but they're doing the best work. I think it's time for you guys to sue Erie, Pennsylvania. Erie County, Pennsylvania, like unbelievable, right? Here's another racism story that I think is super important. We see this, and I think has a potential to have a big impact. We see this at the highest levels of academia, of business, of the professional services, businesses, specifically law firms have gone woke. And so a lot of them have these programs, forward-facing programs, and their goal is to give special benefits to people who, wait for it, aren't white, right? So this was a law firm that has been sued in Maryland in federal court, and their condition for these clerks to apply is you must have an ethnically or culturally diverse background or be a member of the LGBT community. In other words, you got to have sex with the right people, I guess. You got to be sexually attracted. They care, in other words, what your sexual activity is and who you're sexually attracted to matter for this program, or that you're quote unquote ethnically or culturally diverse, whatever that means. So this lawsuit was filed in a federal court in Maryland by a first-year law student who was not eligible for this program at a very large law firm. This to me is a really big deal. And the reason it's such a big deal is because what it means is that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, approved this suit going forward. First, these suits have to be approved by the EEOC before you can bring the federal lawsuit. And so this was a straight white female alleging that King and Spalding, one of the largest law firms in the country, that their Summer Associate Diversity Fellowship violated Title VII. I think this is really important. I think what you're going to see is law firms being forced to back off of this stuff. And I think this is good. God bless this woman who's willing to do it. Young law student plaintiff is Sarah Spidalnik. And obviously she's now made herself unhireable by all the white shoe law firms in the country who won't hire generally young white women, straight white women anyway. but I appreciate her boldness in being willing to file this lawsuit. And the idea that the EEOC has now approved it moving forward is a very good sign. So racism on the rise, but the pushback against it is also on the rise. And I think that's really important. Here's another case. We're going to do a lot of legal stuff today for some reason. These are the things that jumped out to me. And this is a firearms decision out of the Ninth Circuit. I think this is an important one. This is probably the hottest area developing in firearms law right now, post Heller. And that is the question about whether you can keep felons from owning guns. And there are different classes of felonies. Obviously, there are white collar felonies, there are financial crimes, environmental crimes, things like that. And you could see why there would be a challenge to the idea of those kinds of people being deprived of their gun rights, of their Second Amendment rights. So there is a case right now in the Ninth Circuit where the Ninth Circuit invalidated a firearms ownership ban for nonviolent felons. Yep, the Ninth Circuit. Yeah, California, the West Coast. That's right. This is also consistent with the Third Circuit's decision in the Range case, which also found a ban on nonviolent felons owning firearms violated the Second Amendment. So the case in the Ninth Circuit is US v. Duarte. These are going to start to make their way up through the circuit courts or up through the appellate courts into the Supreme Court. Now, SCOTUS already has a case on the docket for October called Rahimi, another one of these felony cases. The question is going to be, is there a historical precedent or analog for keeping felons from owning guns? And the answer is probably, in some cases, violent felons, people who committed violent felonies, people likely to do violence in the future who've committed violent felonies. There's probably historical analog and precedent for that. That is the federal court's decision under Bruin. That's the framework that they set for. So it's going to be interesting as the Rahimi case gets heard by the federal courts, by the Supreme Court. Here's another one, another gun case, which is really interesting to me. A bunch of these popping up all at once. This is in North Carolina. The North Carolina Appellate Court invalidated a lower court decision that allowed a conviction of a homeless man who was seeking treatment at a University of North Carolina medical center. He was found to have guns in the trunk of his car, and those guns, according to North Carolina law, are banned at educational institutions. So applying the Heller test, the court found that the parking lot served no educational purpose. And looking at Bruin, the court said there's no educational analogy available to support this restriction on Second Amendment rights. Amen and amen. This guy didn't have a house. He had his guns appropriately stored, locked in the trunk of his car. He was at a medical center seeking medical treatment for severe kidney problems. Where else was he going to put his guns? And he wasn't there. He wasn't intending to violate the law. He wasn't actually there for educational purposes. So I think the court ruled correctly. I don't know if that'll get appealed and rolled on up, but the Rahimi case is the one to watch coming up in October at the Supreme Court about all of this stuff. Still in the legal world, seems like as a lawyer, maybe I'm just attracted to the legal stories this week. In Trump trial world, which has been salacious to say the least, this week the defense put on its case and it was really short, and then they rested the case. And I think that's appropriate because when you have the prosecutors repeatedly knifing themselves, repeatedly hitting themselves in the face with a hammer, repeatedly running into walls like some kind of bizarre comedic farce like they've done in this case, that's a good time as a defense counsel to stand down, give a quick summary of your case, put on a couple of witnesses, which is what they did, but you don't want to interfere with a prosecution that has completely devastated its own case. Alvin Bragg is partisan. He's a hack. He's disgusting. He's also shown himself, he and his office, to be completely incompetent. Now, maybe they just had such a bad case, there's nothing they could do with it. I think part of that's true, but I think there's been an incredible amount of incompetence. So now we wait for a verdict, right? And there's going to be jury instructions, some motion practice. I'm sure there'll be some procedural fights that take place. I'm sure they'll be asking for a directed verdict again based on no evidence to support the commission of a crime. By the way, what was the crime? I still don't know what the crime is. So what we're going to see is we're going to see this play out, procedural wrangling, jury instructions, and then ultimately it's going to go to the jury. And the question is, can Donald Trump get a fair trial in New York City? My general answer to that is no, of course not. Could Donald Trump get a fair trial, an unbiased trial anywhere? The answer is probably know, not only as president of the United States, but as one of the most controversial figures, certainly as the most well known figure in the world. The odds of him getting a fair and unbiased trial anywhere are pretty slim. In New York City, I'm still voting they're probably going to convict him of something. I'm praying that because there are two lawyers on the jury, I know they still hate Trump. They're New Yorkers, they're classic New York liberal attorneys from everything I can see. But hopefully they, as attorneys, can't convict without knowing what the crime is, without seeing all the elements of the crime met. If they're honest, maybe we'll get a hung jury out of this thing. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. Now, moving away from the law and to international relations, this week we had President Assisi of Iran was killed in a helicopter crash along with the foreign minister. It couldn't happen to a better person. I'm glad to say good riddance. This guy was known as the Butcher of Baghdad, responsible for the executions, the public hangings, the firing squads of thousands of people who had the audacity only to protest for liberty, to be on the streets saying, we don't want women to be subjugated. We don't want gay people to be killed. We just want freedom. We want free rights. We want liberty. And he was behind and specifically personally authorized the killings of thousands of these people, specifically actually known as the Butcher of Baghdad. And unbelievably, countries around the world sent their condolences to Iran for the loss of the Butcher of Baghdad, including our own country through Anthony Blinken, put out a condolences to Iran. Now, Blinken's had to backtrack. He's had to try to explain this as just a normal thing that a country does when the leader of another country dies. But you only have to go back to Bill Clinton for moral clarity. I know that's weird, right? To say Bill Clinton, moral clarity in the same sentence, that seems ridiculous because it is. But Bill Clinton, when Pol Pot, the dictator of Cambodia, died, came out and made a statement which showed absolute moral clarity, listing the horrendous crimes, the cruelty, the tyranny of Pol Pot, the millions of people that died at the hands of his government, the millions of others who suffered in untold ways. That's what Bill Clinton said to memorialize the passing of Pol Pot, not we send our condolences. What has the world come to when Bill Clinton is our beacon of moral clarity? When our government is sending condolences, and not just our government, NATO, other governments around the world, sending condolences on the death of a vicious, brutal killer. By the way, recently green-lighted Hamas to kill over 1,200 civilians in Israel, to burn babies, to rape women to death, to torture people, to take hostages, who's responsible for terrorism all over the world, the greatest state sponsor of terror in the entire world, who's responsible for the deaths of Americans, who's responsible for Hamas still holding today American hostages. And we're going to send condolences on his death. It's really sad when we're looking back at Bill Clinton as our beacon of moral clarity. How's that for a reality check? Speaking of international reality checks at the UN, a villainous hive of scum and infamy. Can you tell what I think about the UN? Multiple states are now proposing recognizing full statehood for the Palestinians. So let's just kind of recount how this happens. We're going to reward Hamas for burning babies alive, raping women to death, killing innocents in front of their families, by the way, taking hostages, which they still hold, being responsible for the entire war in Gaza, because if they surrendered tomorrow, gave up the hostages, the war would end. So for all of this, we're going to reward them and give them recognition in the international community as a state in good standing. You know, like the United States or like England or maybe like Spain, Finland, and Ireland, who are all making this suggestion. Make no mistake, this is a battle of civilizations. This is a war between the Western world and Islam. Islam understands this. Uh, the former president of Iran, now dead, understood this. He spoke openly about their conquest of the West, their coming conquest of the West. And now you have Finland and Ireland and Spain surrendering. This is going to be a time when nations will choose the side. The forward looking into the future as still the future of the West, of liberty, of freedom, of individual rights, of women's rights, of human rights, or backwards, by many centuries into fundamentalist Islam, where women have no rights, where literally no right to drive, no right to leave the house without a male, where they can be beaten by males, where they're property of males. That's the side that Finland and Spain and Ireland have now chosen. This is a time for choosing. Everybody's going to have to choose. And man, you got to give it to these states for choosing societal suicide. I don't get it. All right, let's turn to convention of states. Last week with COS, I spent the weekend at convention, actually the end of the week and part of the weekend at the Republican Party convention in San Antonio. Absolutely incredible. The best part of convention is being there with well over 1,000 convention of states activists. Clearly, easily the largest contingent there at convention. We're convention of states folks. You see buttons everywhere, t-shirts, hats. We definitely were a dominant force there. So I love that. I'm still absorbing a lot of what happened there. I'll have a full report for you next week, but I spent the last half of the week there. So I might even be a little bit behind on news and stuff. I think things are moving the right direction in Texas. Let me just say, generally, I think that the Republican Party of Texas is becoming more and more conservative each cycle. I think in the legislature, I think the Republican Party is becoming more and more conservative each cycle. I look at Texas. I know that the left says they're going to turn Texas blue. I just don't see it. It just doesn't make sense to me based on what's happening in the legislature, based on what's happening in the party. Again, I'll give you more details of what happened next week after we have a chance to absorb all of it. But generally speaking, I say things are moving in the right direction. All right. One last thing I want to talk about today that is a very important subject to me. And as I want to talk about the opponents of convention of states. So now the primary opponents of convention of states around the country are every leftist in the country, every Marxist, Stalinist, left-wing, baby-killing, America-hating organization led by Common Cause, which is a George Soros organization, and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a George Soros organization. They have put together the largest coalition in the history of the left. Over 250 groups signed onto this press release saying that convention of states was the very most difficult thing or most dangerous thing that could happen to the United States of America. And they're open about it. They say because we're working to reverse 75 years, 100 years of progressive gains. Yes, 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 and amen. Yes, that's what we're doing. Absolutely. So all of these leftists, every radical leftist against it. Hillary Clinton personally has spoken out against it. Senator Russ Feingold, the communist from Wisconsin, former senator, wrote an entire book against us, naming me personally, naming Rick Santorum personally. And in favor of calling a convention of states is everybody notable on the right. It's Ben Shapiro, it's Mark Levin, it's Chip Roy, all of these people, professors like Professor Randy Barnett and John Eastman, all of these professors, these great legal scholars, and Mark Levin, all in favor of it. Heritage Foundation in favor of COS, TPPF in favor of COS. So all of these people, Rick Green, David Barton in favor of COS. On the fringe of the opponents are people who claim to be conservatives. I think this is really weird. And so if you're watching this and you're opposed to COS and you claim to be a conservative, who are you really? I mean, really? And what is it that maybe you're hiding? Because before I can take you seriously, before I can take anything you say seriously as a conservative, I have to understand how you're comfortable standing with Common Cause, with George Soros, with Planned Parenthood, with MoveOn.org, with La Raza, and every other leftist organization in the nation, every baby killing, Marxist, Stalinist, communist, America hating organization in the nation. That's who you're standing with. If you're on the right and you say you're standing against COS, I don't get it. You're standing against Heritage. You're standing against Texas Public Policy Foundation, Ben Shapiro, Mark Levine, Rick Green, David Barton of Wall Builders. How can you stand against all of those people and call yourself a conservative? How can you stand with all those radical leftists? How can you be in bed with those people and call yourself a conservative? You know the old saying, lay down with dogs and get fleas, right? That's what you're doing. You're flea bitten, flea ridden at this point. I don't get it. If you can't answer why you're standing with all of those people, if you can't answer why you're holding hands with George Soros, if you can't answer why you have your arms around Planned Parenthood on this issue, if you can't explain that to me adequately, then frankly, you're just not a conservative. Period. Why are you standing with all these evil people? I mean, they say it openly. They admit exactly why they're opposing us, because they want to stop us from reversing progressivism, and you're helping them to do it. They say all the same things that you say about convention of states. They spend millions of dollars literally slandering us, slandering me, slandering convention of states activists. And then you, who claim to be a conservative and are opposed to COS, stand with them side by side, saying the exact same things, using the exact same talking points. And you're standing against real constitutional conservatives. You're putting effort into a war against constitutional conservatives when the communists are actually trying to undermine our country. You're with them and against the Constitution. So before we can have any rational discussion, you can go to our website and look at all the rational points about why a convention of states and why it's safe and how it works and the history and all our endorsements. But before we can even discuss any of that stuff, you owe us an explanation. Why are you standing with the radical left? Why are you standing with Soros and La Raza and Planned Parenthood and MoveOn.org? And frankly, until you can answer that question, you're not a legitimate conservative. And there's really nothing we can do to have a discussion with you. So I would say, if you're a supporter of convention of states, watch what I just said over and over. And when somebody who is a conservative comes to you and bloviates and throws all this leftist claptrap in your face, that you essentially repeat the kind of stuff that I just said and make them respond to you. Push them back on their heels, because I'm tired of them questioning us when they're standing with Soros and Planned Parenthood. All right, we're going to go to Q&A and we're going to close it out. You can put your questions for Q&A at conventionofstates.com. Ask Mark, conventionofstates.com. Ask Mark, and I really will answer anything. So let's go here. We'll start with EJO24. The Supreme Court doesn't run around throwing yellow flags on the executive and legislative branches for unconstitutional issues. Is that because they choose not to, or because they can't? I'm not exactly sure what you mean doesn't run around throwing flags. I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't just weigh in as a referee willy-nilly. It's not up to them. They can't just intervene whenever they want. It takes somebody filing a case, the right plaintiff in the right court at the right time with the right judges, working their way up through the system and getting to the Supreme Court eventually. And so there's no way for them to just run around throwing yellow flags. All right, Dana Roberts says, for the love of God, why can't we introduce COS legislation in every state at the same time? Dana, we do introduce it in every state we possibly can. Of course, we don't introduce it in states where it's already passed. That's 19 out of 34 states. But in every other state, we work hard to introduce this legislation every single year. So for the love of God, we are doing exactly what you're asking. Tracy Grabiak says, when does the current legislative session in North Carolina end? And are there any new developments since the May 15th rally in Raleigh? The answer is, I'm not sure. The session will end when they decide that they're done. So there is no date certain that session will end. That's not how North Carolina works. But I haven't heard of any specific developments since last week. Andrew Shook says, do you think the framers may have intended for Article 5 to be used more regularly by the states to maintain a check on the balance of power rather than as a last option measure? Absolutely, Andrew. I mean, we know that that's what they intended. They gave us this safety valve, not as a last measure, but as a corrective measure anytime the federal government got out of control, which is all the time. So I'm a personal believer that we got to get this first convention done, prove how easily and smoothly it all works, and see what we get out of it. And then we ought to do them fairly regularly when the federal government gets out of control, which seems to be pretty regularly. I'm hoping that federal government behaves itself a little bit more once we have our first convention of states. So I'm going to close out with that. I'm going to tell you guys what I started with, which is make sure that you get out there and you participate in your primaries. You vote, you work for candidates, you give money, you encourage your friends to do the same. Until next week, I am Mark Meckler. This is the Battle Cry. God bless you. I'll see you next Sunday.